What's going on, future me? I just want to get into this week's pre-market plan for the week of November 1st, I believe, or October 31st. With that in mind, I do want to use last week's pre-market plan as a reference. I know that I was basically waiting sells on both GJ and gold. Did not take an entry. I did actually take one that got stopped at break even, so it's not something that's super noteworthy or anything of that sort. I will cover it though. But with all these things in mind, as I mentioned in last week's pre-market plan, I am waiting for a weekly candle close on GJ with strength to then get long. As you guys can kind of see, we got exactly that. This is this is pretty much what I wanted last week's candle to look like. As you guys can see, huge wick to the downside into that previous level of resistance, liquidity zone, supply, whatever you want to call it. Clean rejection off of that and a push to the upside on the weekly, which is more than enough confirmation for me at least to want to get long going into the coming weeks. We could also look at it from the monthly perspective. We finally printed above this level of resistance to confirm the monthly cup and handle. Since there are about 2 days left, but I believe on the 31st it'd pretty much be the last day of the month as well. So nothing super crazy to talk about there. We can even go to the quarterly, right? We're pushing up into this level of liquidity, this sort of range mid. We're breaking this channel as well, pushing into the 618. So I'll just kind of be keeping an eye on that. We still have 2 months left in the quarter just to see how that plays out. But as far as a weekly and monthly perspective is concerned, it is looking pretty bullish. And I do have confirmation for buys, so that's what I'll be geared towards for the coming week. Going into the daily, as you guys can see, right, this was last week's daily candle print that I ended up taking longs on. Ended up getting a small knockback, like a retest of this level that we previously broke inside of the range, and pushed up from there. So with that in mind, right, like when we look at it from that perspective, what I'd want to see from a daily perspective going into next week is a small retest of the level that we just broke, coming into this level here around 167, 168 area, before a push into 175 from a daily time frame perspective. Of course, we are bullish. I would not expect a retest below this weekly zone or this daily zone right here at 168. So that's what I'm going to be looking forward to going into next week. And I just want to kind of make it clear for my future self as well, especially since I was looking for sells last week. If I don't find my setup, if it's not, if I don't see something that's super clean or something that would incline me to want to get into a position that aligns with my plan, then I'm just not going to take it, right? Like, would you rather be right and and entertain bad habits in your trading, or would you rather just follow your trading plan no matter what? And for me, it's the latter, right? I want to follow my trading plan regardless of whether I get into an entry, make profit, lose, whatever it is. It's not about that. It's about following my trading plan and being consistent in that. So that's kind of the lens that I look at it from, and I feel that it's served me well up to this point. So with that in mind, again, just wanting to wait for a retest into this 168 level, this weekly range high, daily range high as well, before I push into 175 area. Just to kind of look at it from the fundamental perspective as well, there was a monetary policy release from the Bank of Japan last week, basically standing firm in their stance on, hey, we're going to do unlimited QE to continue to support our bond market while, also sacrificing their currency. So as we get into the JPYBasket, you guys will see that, of course, the yen is tanking. I believe I don't know if it was Kuroda or one of the other Bank of Japan officials or country, or state country officials, whatever you want to call it, they basically glossed over how a weak yen is actually beneficial for Japan's economy in their perspective. So with that in mind, that makes a great case for GJ longs, especially since we have a falling yen, a temporarily strengthening GBP, and of course I'll get into that as I look at the indexes and everything else. But just again, with that in mind, it gives me much more conviction in taking GJ buys. So looking at the 4 hour, right, makes it a lot more clear. I love looking at the 4 hour as well. Just going into lower time frames and everything else. As you guys can see, this is where we kind of topped out last week, this October 22 high and last week candle high. With that in mind, right, we do have sort of a doji, like a pausing indecision sort of candle. So we could expect, of course, either a push going into next week, but personally, I'm looking more so for a retrace to get a better entry into these sort of next levels and ranges and everything else. So of course, I drew my fib low to high, this swing low to this swing high here. and it aligned perfectly with the 618 in confluence with that June high as well. So I would love to see a retest of that level prior to entering a position. This is about I would say, what is it, about a 200 pip range, 260 pip range as well. So it does have a bit of room to sort of wiggle around in before it does make that move to the upside. I wouldn't want to be trading any sort of consolidation or chop. If we get a strong push into this October 22 high, then I'll just monitor it. I could also take my fib, right? Take it right here. Take it from this low to this high. We might get a little bit more shallow of a retest around the 170 area before a push up. But, in the perfect world, the ideal situation, the entry that I would be wanting to look for would be right around this June high at 168.72. If we can get a clean retrace there before the push up, I'll then be entering. Or maybe we get again a more shallow retrace around the 170 level, or back on top of this candle close here at 170 170,500. But again, personally, as far as my plan is concerned, I'll be waiting for that June high retest. We, spent a lot of time consolidating within this area, building a base around this area. So this is a perfect level for price to come back to before making a bigger push to the upside. That would still be sort of a higher low in many respects if we do get to see that retrace. Again, we could also see the higher low from this perspective at like 160. 169.75 area, perfect level with a little bit of liquidity. We have these wicks here as well. We can kind of mark that off if we'd like. Perfectly in confluence with the 618 as well. So those are two areas I'll kind of be looking at. I do have alerts set for those areas as well. So again, I'll just be monitoring those moves and those retraces prior to entering a position. Looking at it from the 1 hour perspective, and I don't want to take up too much time just because it's pretty straightforward as far as the overall plan for GJ is concerned. Same sort of deal, right? I would expect a retest, especially when you look at it from this perspective, right? We're instead of forming like a rounded top, we have we kind of call this a tweezer top here as well, or potential evening star forming type of thing that would then push price into this level at 170, into that 618 as well. You see, there's a small zone here, lots of wicks and everything else, so it's definitely an area of interest that I'll be waiting to see tested prior to entering a position. This is a bounce or break level for me. If we don't, of course, bounce from this level back into 171, I'll then wait until we push into that June high to then enter, to then push into 170 and eventually break into 171 area once again. So I hope that's clear. Again, just to kind of recap, we did get this weekly candle close with strength above that weekly range high, confirming buys for me. Daily, same sort of deal. What I would like to see, of course, is a push back into that June high before a move to the upside into the 171, 175 range. 4 hours, same sort of deal, makes it much more clear. We did stop out at this October 22 high. End of the month is basically next week. So we could see a small push to the downside to retest that June high, or a bit higher than that into like the 170, 169, 500 area before a move up into 171, 175. 1 hour, same sort of deal. Again, wanting to wait for a retest and retrace of this level at 169, 900, 170 area in confluence with that 618 and this zone here. Sort of a range mid as well to push back into 171. If we break 170, 169, 800 area, I'll then wait for the push into the June high at 168.72 prior to entertaining longs. But again, I will only be looking for longs unless, of course, if in the scenario where we break all the way back below the September 22 high, because we've built a very stable base here, in the event that we break back below that level, I'll probably short it into the next range from 167 into 166.31 back at this last week candle high. But I don't think, or rather, I don't see a scenario where that happens. So again, mainly monitoring the 170, 169, 800 area and the June high at 168.72 to take the loans and push into the 171 and eventually the 175 area. And these are pretty big ranges, right? We have a 151 pip range here from 169, 800 into that 171 area. And then, if we break back below that, we have like a 115 pip range into the June high. If we could, of course, push from the June high back into 171, that's a pretty big range here as well, 260 pips, which I covered on the 4 hour. So a couple possibilities, but again, I will only be looking to take longs from those two levels at 169, 800 and 170, and then that level at 168.72. So I hope that makes sense. Going into gold here, there were a couple really good moves here that I didn't take on gold. There was one in particular, this one here on Friday, really good push to the downside, pretty much in line with our plan. But I didn't take it because it was basically an hour before London session. It was 2 a.m. I wasn't at the desk or looking at the chart during this time. I was fast asleep. So not necessarily a missed opportunity for me either, because I generally don't trade on Fridays. So, it is what it is. As well, I did have a missed entry on Wednesday, though. This would have been a really good sell if I would have got into this 160, like this 160, or excuse me, the 1675 area. It didn't trigger my alert. It just hit it right on the button, right? Like right at this last week candle low. Last week candle high for the week of the 24th. But it is what it is. Not super pressed about that. Let's start on the weekly. As you guys can see, we're still pretty much bearish. We have not even attempted to break out of this channel. Still respecting that weekly sort of range low turned into resistance now. So again, especially with the way this candle closed, long went to the upside, much larger body to the downside. I'd expect us to continue to move lower for the coming days, weeks, months, especially with this week, right? We have a ton of stuff going on. It's NFP week. Bank of England is doing their bank rate stuff. Feds releasing their rate here in the US as well. So going to be a lot of volatility this week, and I think that's more than enough to push gold much lower. So when we get into the daily, same sort of deal, right? I believe I mentioned last week as well, this sort of microstructure, this sort of pseudo neckline retest that could have occurred. It played out exactly as stated. But again, I did miss my entry on it, so it doesn't really for me, like, it doesn't really it would have been much more gratifying rather to have gotten into that entry, but it wasn't something I was looking to entertain, especially when I look at it from the perspective of like how the strength of those candles pushing into those zones looked. Excuse me. I didn't want to fade that strength, especially with the weak dollar, and we'll get into that as well when I get into the indexes, because we were falling pretty sharply on the DXY, but ended up finding a floor, as I mentioned as well in the pre-market plan, right? Like, we'll fall 100%, but generally, especially with the way the market's looking right now, I would just expect to find another floor and push higher for the dollar, especially given, all the fundamental drivers and all these different things acting as catalysts for a strong dollar. So of course we get little retraces, but we always find a floor and eventually push higher, in my opinion. So as you guys can see, right, pushed into last week, we had these candle closes right here, very strong push to the upside the previous week, and then the beginning of last, or this last week of the 24th, we did get sort of another push into this range mid sort of liquidity zone, this weekly level as well, just like we did back here, and I took those shorts. Same sort of scenario, just didn't get to take that position, which is a little bit of a bummer, but again, I mean, it's not make or break. Next week is a new week, and I'm sure I'll find a very similar scenario to the one that we saw back here. Going into the 4 hour, right? This is where it becomes a lot more clear, and I start to see a pattern being sort of formed. We have this sort of range mid area that keeps on getting used as support, right? A very temporary support, sort of retrace into this to this liquidity zone at 1659. So I did place this bubble here. I'm waiting for a break and retest below this level in confluence with the 618 before I make a move to sort of get into a sell and everything else. Very similar once again to what we saw back here when I made that I believe that was a 4% position or 4% trade just on gold. Have sort of this rounded bottom, this sort of morning star, literally same exact sort of structure. We have this big push doji candle, small sort of bullish candle. I wait for, of course, momentum to the upside into that level before I take a sell. So I'm looking at exactly, literally for the exact same thing. We've had it happen multiple times. We had it once, twice, 3 times, and maybe even a fourth, right? This could also kind of be, you could kind of look at it from the perspective of like a head and shoulders type of thing. So we have the left shoulder, head, and if we push back into this 618 and get rejected, this would be the right shoulder. So that's exactly what I'll be looking for. For next week. Again, I'll be waiting for a push back into 1659 to retrace to the 618, as well as retesting this level of liquidity that we've been bouncing off of time and time again, to then take sells into 1644 and eventually break into 1614. Overall, especially since, again, we didn't break back into this weekly level at 1678. As I mentioned in my last pre-market plan, a clean break back into the weekly range equals a potential reversal to 1725. This is a bounce or break area. We did bounce from that level, so I'll be looking for the next sort of lower high to be created before taking sells. I hope that makes sense, right? Like, again, just to kind of recap, still printing below this this weekly level, this sort of range mid, this liquidity zone here, in confluence with these different fib levels. Bounced off of it to a T, right? Like, just barely touched this zone before getting knocked back. So again, I'll be expecting sort of the same thing going into next week. Coming into the zone, getting knocked back, and once we do reach the zone, I will be looking for sells. Yeah, I don't want to. I know I ramble a little bit, so I don't want to. At least for my future self, I don't want to kind of muddy up the waters and dilute the point of the plan, right? Like, you know, where I want to get in and my areas of interest, this whole thing. So I just thought I should make that clear. Going into the 1 hour. Structure looks super clean, right? We have these sort of equal lows that I believe we could run. We do have these two we do have these two rounded bottoms here as well. So just like we have right here, this equal bottom and a push into 1659, we do have this rounded bottom here. Same sort of thing. I'll wait for a push into 1659. We could stop up a little bit shorter from, you know, based on this fib from this swing high to this swing low at 1655. But of course, I'll be wanting to get in at 1659. If I start to see us, you know, sort of roll over at 1655, I'll entertain it. But in the ideal scenario, I'd want to wait for that last week candle low at 1659 to get touched and that alert to get triggered before I enter a trade. Especially since that's a much more significant level. Like, we've seen a lot more activity at that level as far as, you know, resistance turning into support and vice versa. Especially if we look left, right? This is a very respected level, and I could expect price to push into that level before getting knocked back into 1645 and eventually 1614. So again, that's exactly what I'll be looking for as far as a push is concerned. Next week, market open, I'll expect a push either into the 1657, 618 level or 1659 before a move back into 1644 and an eventual break down to 1614 when we have the next level of sort of support. I would expect to run these equal lows as well. So it's an area I'll monitor, this little sort of microstructure, this level of support, but it's not something that I'm going to consider like a bouncer break or make or break level for price. The most important sort of SR level is still this one here, where we have multiple weekly candle closes in the liquidity zone at. So that'd be a much more significant level for me personally to break down into. So I hope that makes sense. Once again, that is gold. Just to quickly recap once more, weekly still bearish, have not printed above that weekly level or, you know, this sort of liquidity zone. Also has fib confluence at the 382. Only way I'm getting bullish is if we get a channel break into 1725 and further from there, and it does not look like price wants anything to do with that move. Daily, same thing. We are bouncing off of that weekly level every time we push into this zone. Always gets knocked back. Does have a small fib confluence with the 50 and the 618 here as well. Going into the 4 hour, I would expect a knockback from that same level. We do have very similar patterns playing out here as well, with the sort of evening star formations and this support being built on this this sort of range mid level here. We always get a small push when we close in this level, and then we eventually break back down once we reach this this level of liquidity. Great thing is, this level of liquidity also lines up and is in confluence with the 618. So of course, it makes all the sense in the world for me, at least, to want to get short from those levels. We'll wait for a retest of that before getting short. 1 hour, same exact thing. We have multiple levels of structure here that are particularly important, that are respected as well. So I'll wait for a retest of those levels before getting short. 1659 specifically, play it back into 1644. We'll wait for the eventual break down into 1614. I will not be taking shorts until I see a retest of these levels. So that's kind of gold in a nutshell. Hope that made sense for my future self and everyone else involved. Going into some of the indexes, I want to start with the dollar, right? Just looking at the DXY, I don't like to look at lower time frame stuff on indexes like this, but as you guys can kind of see, we are, sort of forming a range now here. We did break this trend line, I believe. Last week, I did mention how we're still sitting on top of this trend line, which is great. If we did get a breakdown, I expected just to find another floor, and that's exactly what we did. Of course, it's awesome that it basically drove right into the 618 prior to sort of bouncing. But I think that's kind of the story for the dollar, right? Like, of course, we get these small retracements. We can even look at it from the weekly. We get these small retracements before a bigger push to the upside, and I think it's particularly funny when these sort of moves happen before big news comes out, because of course, right, we get a rate hike next week, and that generally pushes the dollar up. So it's all the sort of stars align to make that a reality, right? Not only do we have the daily trend line that was broken, but all it did was break into a weekly trend line, also in confluence with this 382. We also have sort of a small floor here based on these candle closes that we sort of retested. So again, I don't expect the dollar to fall too much from here. If we broke like 108 from a daily perspective, then I could be entertaining reversals and start to talk about it from that perspective. But again, I think that we've just found a floor here, and we're going to continue to rally, which would act as a sort of factor when you think of it from the perspective of like, okay, I want to short gold, so the dollar must go up in that case, right? So that's kind of my bias towards it, right? Like, of course, we have the 382 weekly trendline retest. We're trading within a range. We found the floor already. I would expect a push higher going into next week, especially with the fundamental drivers and the news that's coming out going into next week. So that's kind of my dollar sort of perspective in a nutshell. Just to go back into the quarterly, it's kind of awesome to see how this fractal is playing, basically doing the same exact thing as the previous sort of pattern, right? We have this big push, upper wick, no sort of lower body wick here either, and then we sort of have this, this sort of this sort of pausing candle, this indecision sort of candle. Before another push the following quarter. So it's just, I'm following this fractal pretty closely. It looks like it's playing out to a T. Literally, when you look at it from like a candle to candle perspective, right? Like we push into the zone, it's literally the same exact candle, and now we have a small sort of retrace, small bearish candle this quarter. So again, overall sentiment is a bullish dollar for me. I don't think we should fade the dollar strength whatsoever unless we break this level at 108. But until we do, I will continue to wait for the dollar to, pick another floor before a push up. I hope that makes sense. So now going into JPYBasket. Of course, as I mentioned while I was covering GJ, the Bank of Japan will continue to print. They will continue to use QE to buy up, assets, buy up Japanese bonds and everything else to save their bond market while also sacrificing the yen. And again, I just want to reiterate that I believe it was Kuroda or one of the governors of the Bank of Japan did mention that a weak yen is good for the Japanese economy. So, of course, with that sort of sentiment coming straight from the bank, you would expect, again, a weak yen going into the following weeks, months, years, and so on. And that's exactly what we're seeing here, right? We continue to break back below this weekly range low. We're also forming a channel now here, a sort of downtrend in the overall, downtrending picture, right? So I would expect further downside for the yen, especially again with them staying sort of solid in their stance as far as QE and overall printing is concerned and everything else. They are basically devaluing their currency at will, but that's their decision. So I would expect, again, yen weakness, and as far as how that plays into the pairs that I trade, yen weakness is a catalyst for GJ loans. And of course, going into, this next week, as I mentioned while I was covering GJ, I am looking for buys after a retest of said levels. And of course, a weak yen acts in confluence with that. So moving on to GBP futures, we did have some GBP strength, and again, this sort of strengthens my conviction for GBP JPY buys, especially since we're pushing back into this weekly level. This could be a retest of of 116, 117 area before I move down, but we did get sort of around the bottom, long way to the downside. prior to that. So we could be seeing a small reclaim of this weekly level and a break of this daily channel here as well. Of course, I would want to see price break and retest this level at 116, 117 area before moving higher. But it does look like GBP is gaining strength once again. We also have big news coming out for the pound next week as far as the official bank rates and everything else. And the Bank of England is going to be, hosting press conferences, this whole thing. So there's going to be a ton of volatility going into next week. I do want to highlight, though, last month when the Bank of England ended up raising rates, GBP ended up falling. So that's something to take into consideration. I actually got chopped up in that sort of scenario as well, because I was looking at it from the perspective of, okay, every time there's a rate hike in the US, the dollar ends up going up. So I would expect the same thing, right? The Bank of England, we know, is going to raise rates, so GBP should go up. The opposite happened, right? US dollar rate hike equaled, dollar going higher, but inversely, when the rates went up from the Bank of England, the GBP went lower. So that's just something I'm going to keep in mind going into this next week, especially considering we're at a pretty big level of resistance. We're at this channel high and sort of this level of resistance here based on this previous candle, this sort of candle high here as well. So just something I'm going to keep in mind. Of course, I would love to see GBP strength into next week, especially since I'm looking for GJ loans. But even if we got like a knockback for the pound, we still have a ton of yen weakness that we can use as a catalyst and as a factor behind us wanting to take GJ loans. So that's kind of my perspective on the indexes. Just to kind of recap, dollar will never fade the strength of the dollar until we break this 108 level of support, which doesn't look like we're doing. We did break this daily trend line, but we fell right into the 618, built a base there, and we're now looking like we're wanting to push up. This is a sort of indecision candle on the daily, so I wouldn't take it too much into consideration, because this could be a small pause before I move higher. Weekly, all we've done is basically print on top of that weekly trend line and built a base here as well within this small sort of range, also in confluence with the 382. So once again, I think that we've just found the floor and we're moving higher, especially with rate hikes coming this week and all of the news that would potentially force the dollar higher. Quarterly, same sort of thing. I think it's interesting to see how these fractals line up and how they're basically following each other to the T, even to the candle, right? Like same sort of candle formations and everything else. So that's sort of my sentiment. Bullish dollar going into the next couple of weeks, months, and so on. JPYBasket, once again, falling down in a straight line, right? Like the Bank of Japan will continue printing. They've stood firm, on their stance on monetary policy and everything else. Unlimited QE, that whole thing. And they also highlighted how a weak yen is good for their economy, so you would expect for it to stay weak, which would be a catalyst for GJ loans. GBP, same sort of thing. We do have this weekly level that's potentially being reclaimed, and this daily channel that's potentially being broken. But again, I do want to highlight the fact that every time there is, or not necessarily every time, but my experience last time was that when we had a rate hike, from the Bank of England, we did end up pushing lower on the GBP. So that's something that I'll be looking to monitor closely, especially since, again, rate hikes for the dollar means the dollar goes higher, but for some reason, rate hikes for the GBP in turn means a weak pound. So that's kind of my sentiment. Once again, I'll be monitoring all these things closely. If I do execute a position, of course, I'll update myself, my future self, and my channel and everything else. So overall, I hope this makes sense. Future me, I hope you're having a great day. Love you, bro. And keep being your best self. Take care. God bless.